In this video, I demonstrate how I paint this still life of glass objects. One of the challenges is being able to draw these abstract shapes in the reflections, so I spend some time giving tips on how to draw them more accurately. I also spend time on mixing colors because that's an important part of creating the illusion of transparency. There are timestamps in the description below so you can jump to the sections that you're interested in. One of the important parts of painting the illusion of transparent glass is getting all these abstract shapes drawn correctly. That way, when you fill it with color, it creates the illusion of transparency. I don't always use a grid, but if you're really struggling with accuracy in your drawing, this will help you, especially in the beginning. That's what I'll do next, is I'll draw the grid, and then I'll show you how this helps you to draw the shapes more accurately. Sometimes it's hard to erase the grid, and I have a trick for overcoming that, and that is I use a water-soluble pencil. This is burnt sienna. What makes this really convenient, when you're done with the grid, you could just take a damp rag and totally erase it. You could draw it with pencil and just leave it in there, but sometimes it's nice to be able to just erase it if you want to. There's some geometry tricks here, so you don't have to measure everything. If you draw an X across it, where they meet will be halfway. So that's the middle of the board. It helps to have a right triangle. This is perfectly 90 degrees. If I line it up on the edge, then I could just draw the vertical line that way. Now it's even easier, if you just draw diagonals across each section, you'll get the center of those parts too. Then the final step is to just connect these centers. So there we have it. It's all gridded out and I didn't have to measure anything. Another important point is you want to make sure that your canvas or your panel has the same exact proportion as your reference photograph. And that's because if you had a reference photograph that's this wide, and then let's say your canvas is more of this proportion, you'd be squashing all that down into that smaller rectangle, and it would look compressed. So that's just something to keep in mind. I like to do my drawing with acrylic markers. I made an entire video about this. I start off with a light color that you can barely see, and then I make corrections with darker markers. You could just draw with pencil and everything would be fine. Works well with painting with acrylics, and you can paint over these with oils. I don't recommend using solvent-based markers like a Sharpie because it might bleed through your paint after you paint over the top of it. That's parchment. That's gray number 8. I've got raw sienna, which is even darker, and burnt sienna. This is Posca, so there's black. So I'll start with parchment, and the whole idea behind this is you only have to keep track of each square by itself. So it gives you a reference point. For example, this stripe ends right here on this line, so you know you'll have the exact right placement of it. If you're just drawing by eye, let's say you place it over here, then everything after that will be off too. So this gives you confidence that you know where the ends of everything is, like this glass is right on the edge of this line. And you can also sort of figure things out mentally, like I could look at the bottom of this glass, and it looks like it's about halfway from this line to here. And you can also measure it by using your thumb and a pencil, and you can see that is about halfway down here. So this helps you to figure out where each shape belongs on the canvas. So I think the bowl, and see with these markers, I don't care about making mistakes. I made these lines all over here, and with acrylics you can paint over it. So the edge of this bowl is close to the center of this, and then I mark the bottom of the bowl in the left side, and I think the top goes about here, and the outside of that ellipse is about here. I think the center of the bowl is maybe here, so if you draw an ellipse, and this could be totally off, I really don't care. I'm just trying to figure out where things should go. I've got the basic shapes of this bowl in here, but I'm not going to put too much detail in until I put the rest of the stuff in here. Here's the bottom of the glass. Like I said, it's at the halfway point, halfway down from this line to here. Like I said, that's halfway down from here to there. But I can also use these edges to sort of figure out how far this should extend into this top right box. There are a lot of details within the bottom of this drinking glass. All these little shapes and things I have to get in there, but it doesn't make sense to draw that in there until I get the placement of the larger outer shape right first. Otherwise, you end up drawing all this detail and then you realize it should move over by a little bit, and then you have to move all that stuff over. The whole concept here is start with the big shapes And once you're confident those are in the right place, you can go back in and put in the smaller shapes. There's a lemon that's supposed to be here, but notice I just drew right through that shape anyways because this is such a light color, it doesn't matter. That helps you to get like the horizon line of the table level rather than trying to draw around the lemon. The edge of this bowl goes a little bit higher than what I have. I think it goes about here. There's a tendency to draw the ellipse too wide. You have to look at how it actually is in the photograph. So the thing about glass is there's all these weird shapes in here, and I'll start putting some of those in there. So there's like these highlight sections I'll put in. There's darker sections that just sort of follow the contour of the bowl. And I'll have to draw in these reflected stripes. I'll probably do that last. Like I said, I want to make sure I have the lemons in there right before I put all this little detail in here. What you really want to look for are these shapes that are between here. Like there's this darker blue shape between these two lemons. There's like this little squiggle shape here. You just have to look at that and try to figure out where they belong. That's like the foundation of being able to paint transparency. Once you get those shapes in there, if you could mix these colors and fill it in, it'll look transparent. That's pretty much how the camera does it. The camera doesn't think about this being transparent. It just figures out that this is a certain color and that color next to it is a little bit lighter and less blue. So that's what we have to do. Figure out what these shapes are, draw them, and then fill it in. This gets a little bit more complicated here where there's like subtle gradients happening, but it's just like painting anything else. Here's that highlight shape. It comes out like that, and then the bottom juts out again, and there's a highlight underneath it. I'll go back in with a darker color and refine it, but for now I just want to sort of place it in there. There's another one on this side. The darker section slants at an angle like this, and it sort of continues, but it doesn't come out as far. Maybe it comes out to about here, and it cuts in because I think the bowl curves. The thing about using a light color like this is you could fill in some of the darker sections just to sort of like give an idea of where the shadows are. The other thing too is there's a lot of tiny little specular highlights on here. That doesn't need to go in this drawing. Just sort of choose like the largest shapes. I'm seeing one here. And if you get those right, then those smaller ones are easy to place in when you're painting. I have the basic shapes mapped out. Now I'm making corrections with the darker color. So I can come in and get the shape a little bit more refined. It seems like I'm taking a lot of time on the drawing, but it's so much faster to get it all squared away in the drawing stage. For example, if I painted this handle in and I realized I had to move it up, I'd have to paint all those details in all over again. Whereas I could just draw over the top of this with a darker color. And as I progress, it gets easier. I already have sort of like an idea of where these shapes should be. I'm just refining it. So this is the hardest part, and now I just go in and put in the more subtle details and make corrections. So I finished up the drawing, and you'll notice that I scrub in some color in some of these sections. And that's just to remind me that this is the stripe that's blue, and this is the one that's white. Sometimes when you get involved in a painting, you might fill in the wrong stripe. Like I might fill this with blue instead of this section here that I toned. It only takes a second or two just to put that in there as a reminder. Now that the acrylic marker is dry, I can wipe off the watercolor pencil with a damp rag. You want to make sure this is dry first though. This is somewhat influenced by printmaking where you would use one material that's water soluble and another that's not. So the watercolor pencil is totally gone, and now I can start mixing colors. Let me know in the comments if you want a more in-depth video on how to use a grid for drawing. There are a couple advantages to using a photograph rather than drawing from life. For one, the ice won't melt in front of your eyes, but it also makes it easier to draw these reflections in transparent glass. And that's because you have binocular vision. One eye sees something slightly different than the other eye, and it really becomes obvious when you look at something that has a lot of reflections in it. Because one eye is seeing one set of reflections and another eye could be seeing a different set, and it really makes it hard to draw. If you do draw from life, you can try closing one eye just so that you're seeing one set of reflections. But I highly recommend, especially when you're starting out, to use a reference photo. It just flans out the shapes and it makes it easier to draw. So the next step is I'll mix some of the colors up. I won't mix up all of them, but it would make sense to do the background color and some of these blues before I begin. These are the acrylic paints I'm going to be using. They're the Winsor Newton Professional Acrylics. I bought the kit of 12 colors, and I also purchased a huge tube of white because you go through more white than any other color. These are different than their student line of Galleria acrylics. Here's a kit of those. There's a couple differences. One is in the professional acrylics, the binder is less cloudy, so there's less color shift. But another difference with like professional acrylics is that the pigment load is higher, so the colors can be a little bit more vivid. I've been testing these out and they do dry slower. I think they add a little bit of retarder to the paints, so it makes it a little bit easier to blend. People sometimes ask me why I wear gloves when I paint, and I made a whole video about that. There's a link to it in the description below. And I also have more related videos. I have one about how I set up this glass palette. It's in the section in the description called related videos. This is actually a glass cutting board within a Masterson Stay Wet palette. Works really well because you can use a safety razor scraper to scrape off paint even if it's dry. So I'll just set these colors up real quick and we'll get started with mixing colors. So this is the phthalo blue. This is ultramarine blue. I don't need so much red. I might not even put that much out. That's naphtha red, light. Alizarin crimson. Lemon yellow. That's the azo yellow medium, and that's a little bit more orange. So I put up more white than any other color. So this is my palette knife. And what I noticed is that with a palette knife, the blade is pretty long. So when you mix colors, you end up with a big patch of color. So sometimes people comment, you're mixing colors with a painting knife. But the thing is, I feel like I can get more piles of color in here in a smaller space because it's not going to spread the paint all over my palette. I'm not going to demonstrate mixing all of these colors. I'll just do a few of them just so you get the idea. I have an entire playlist about color theory, and if you look at my shorts, there's a ton of videos where I mix the color of like apples and different foods, and I go outside and I match colors. There's tons of those videos if you want to watch them. I also have a color mixing course. There's a link to it in the description below. So I'll just mix maybe this blue here and maybe a couple other colors. So this is like the blue bowl plus the gray of the background. So I'm thinking I'll start with ultramarine blue and some titanium white. So that's much too vivid and it has to go darker. I think I'll add some alizarin crimson. I should actually mix more of this now that I think of it. I should have squeezed out more color. So I'll just add more of the white and then a little bit more of the alizarin, and let's see what we get here. Okay, I can tell already that needs more white, and the alizarin crimson will make it sort of like more purplish and a little bit more dull. So let's mix this up and see what we have. Okay, so the first thing I notice is it's too dark. So a little bit more alizarin. It has to go lighter. Usually it's best to address the most glaring problem, and with this it was too dark. Now this is a video about how to paint the transparent effects of glass, and I'm spending a lot of time on drawing and mixing colors, but that's what you need to do in order to make it look transparent. It's not like you can just wing these colors and expect it to look like it's transparent. I still think it needs more white. A little bit more ultramarine and some more alizarin because I overdid the white there. So my paints are getting a little bit tacky. Give it a little mist. I added too much white, and that's just a normal part of color mixing. It's not as if you're doing this by measuring colors out with a scale and you have a formula or something. Sometimes people say it's like tuning a piano. You have to go a little bit too far sometimes and then come back and correct it if you go too far. So a little more alizarin and ultramarine, and I think we'll get pretty close to this. I think it needs a little more alizarin. And maybe just a dash of yellow, that will make it a little bit more neutral. I'd say that's close enough. If you watch my YouTube shorts, a lot of them are color matching videos, and I take it to the extreme to where you can't tell the difference sometimes. So I would say if you get like 80% there, it's good enough. So a lot of times people ask me, do you go through that process for every single color in the painting? And the answer is no, because you just do the basic colors. So I'm thinking with the gradient, I could do this color and that color, and then maybe mix the two together and get this middle color and then just blend them together. And it's the same with like the bowl. I'll do this color, maybe this brighter blue and this dark section. And as I paint, I can mix them together to get all these different shades of blue. So it's not as tedious as you think it is. I'll do some of this background color, and I wasn't going to use any of the earth colors, but I think I might use the raw umber to make this background color. I would rather have like burnt umber because it's darker, but we'll see how this works. I'll test a little bit of it out. So usually I have an entire video on how to mix black. This isn't a totally neutral black. It seems like there's some color in there. It's a little bit more magenta. So one formula is ultramarine blue, and an earth color usually makes like black. So you could use burnt sienna or burnt umber. So that's ultramarine, and this is raw umber. It looks a little greenish, so maybe a little alizarin crimson. Although that's not bad. I think it's funny. This is already too dark. I'll add just a touch of white in here. So that kind of matches this section here. So this will work. I'll mix more of it because this background's pretty big. I'm going to mix that up, and then I'll come back and do like this light gray section. I think I can add white to this and then sort of like neutralize it so it's not so like magenta. I mixed up more of this dark color for the corner, and then I can add a little bit of white to this. And that's definitely a little bit too pink. I think maybe it'll be fine for this area, but over here, if I add more white to it, I still don't think that will be the color. It's not bad. I think maybe a little bit of ultramarine. You know, the thing is, my printer might be a little bit biased towards magenta, but I also like having color in the background. If you compare it to this gray of this board, this is pretty neutral gray. If you look at this gray compared to this board, which is pretty neutral, there's definitely color in there. That's the thing about using black, is a lot of times it'll make a gray that's too neutral. And part of that is when you look at something in nature or in a subject like this, your mind just assumes it's gray because it's desaturated, but it's actually a color. So just a touch of ultramarine blue should make this a little bit more on the cool side. So that matches pretty well. I might mix up more of that just so that I have more paint to work with. I'm going to get my brushes set up and everything, and then I'll start painting. I'm going to start off with this dull blue color, and I'll paint some of this darker section here too. This brush is a nylon brush from Princeton. This is just a basic nylon brush. This color looks pretty dark, but I think it's because there's so much white around it. I'm seeing like subtle variations in here, which I'll come back into and lighten up. I probably mixed too much of this color, but that's a good thing. What's really frustrating is you're almost done and you run out of a color and you got to remix it. It's better to have too much paint, and then when you're done, you can just mix it all together into a color and save it. I have an entire video about how I save leftover paint. Actually, I have a couple of them. You can put them in empty paint tubes, but I found with like open acrylics and even regular acrylics, I stored in a syringe, which is kind of weird, but it really keeps the paint fresh because the syringe is airtight. It's kind of like a paint tube that collapses as you use it. So there's no air in there, or very little air. I think what I'll do is just block this in and come back in and put a little bit more subtle variations into it. I have this color blocked in. Now I'll go back in, and I can see there's like sections that are a little bit lighter. It gets darker over on this side, so I didn't fill it in yet. So here's this lighter section. I'll add a little bit of white and I'll paint that in. There's a little bit more here and here too. So it's pretty obvious. You just add a little bit of white to it. And that's what I mean is you have the basic color, and when you spread it out like this, you can designate one section to be a little bit lighter. I often keep scraps of paper and I test it out on the paper first. When I do color matching videos, I use strips like this, and that's where this came from. So you can see that's a little too dark. So I'll just add a little bit more white to it. And that looks closer. I think I could use just a little bit more. Okay, maybe that's a little bit too light. These are fine tweaks. I mean, as long as it's a little bit lighter, it would work. So I think that's pretty good. I'll just use this. And this is where you just draw while you're painting. Like I could tell, like you look for different landmarks, and here's the tip of the lemon, and that's kind of where that shape is, so that's where I'll paint that in. There were a couple of streaks like right here and here. I think that looks like it gets a little warmer. So I'm putting a little alizarin crimson, maybe a touch of yellow. It's not bad. I think a little bit lighter. I'd say that's close enough. Now, to smooth that out, it's not too hard. I can find a brush. I'll just take a clean brush and try to smooth that out a little bit. Maybe a smaller one. I can always dip into like the darker section and just sort of like work that in there. The other thing I'm thinking too is maybe I could put a little bit of the gray on the outside just so that I have a color to judge it against. I'll take a little bit of this lighter gray and just work it in over here. It just makes it easier to judge a color when it's actually against another color. So this white makes this look darker than what it really is. I feel like that's a little too magenta, but I added a little bit of ultramarine. So that gray matches pretty well near the edge of this bowl, but I need to add more white as it goes down. I think what I'll do is just put it in there, even if it's a little bit inaccurate, it'll help me to sort of judge this blue. Maybe I'll add a little bit of that dark color along the top here. So I'm not going to worry about the background too much right now. I think I might come in and do the background all at once, but I just want to get some basic colors in there first. So I'll pick up a little bit of white, just to lighten that up slightly. And then I could take some of this darker color and work it in there. I don't think this is going to match right off the bat, but we'll take a look. So that's not too bad. I think I'll just go with that for now. I think I'll put this dark color of the edge of the bowl in. That'll help me judge the gray color and this more dull blue color. The section at the top is a little bit darker, so I'll use that for the dark section. Switching to this fine detail brush, just to put the edge of the bowl in here. And you can use like a wood stick to rest your hand, so you don't get your hand in your paint. I'm not worried about the jaggedness of the line underneath. I'm just trying to get the outer edge of the rim kind of smooth. This is an old beat up watercolor liner brush. I find it's good for putting in like fine lines. When you paint fine lines, it helps to thin the paint out with water a little bit. It just makes the paint flow a little bit easier. Underneath that highlight is like a darker shadow line. I put that in there and it gets darker when it starts curving around the edge here. It's all these little details that start to make it look shiny and transparent. The next color I like to put in is this brighter blue color, and I think that'll help me to determine if I got these shades right. I think it's when you add all the different shades of blue in here, it really sells the transparency of it. So I just want to establish like this light blue color and this section underneath the lemons. So for that, I'm just using ultramarine blue and titanium white, and I'll see if that's close. So that's not too bad. I think it's a good place to start. I think I just need to adjust it for some areas, like it's a little bit darker down here. I think what I'll do is focus on this area right here and touch that up. This color looks like it's a combination of like this light blue and then maybe some of this darker blue. So I'll just add some of this dark blue color in there. And we'll see how that looks. It's not too bad. It has to go a little darker. I'll put some blue off to the side, and then that way I could just sort of dip into it. I think that's pretty good for this section here, but this has to go darker. So that's what I was talking about when I started mixing the colors. It was that you get the basic main colors, and then you could just go in to adjust it. So the point is that I started with like the basic colors like this medium blue and this dark blue. And then from there, it's much easier to mix these more subtle shades because you already have colors to start with. You're just adapting them. This is kind of challenging to paint because what is this shape? It's not like you're painting a lemon, you have an idea of what a lemon looks like, but it's just all these weird abstract shapes, and that's what you really have to focus on in order to get the painting to look like it's transparent. You have to get the right color in there, and it's a little bit tricky. So I added more white in here, and that's getting this lighter highlight in here. I might not have the shape totally perfect. The idea is just to sort of like establish the basic color in here, and then come back and tweak it a bit. I'm gonna work on this a little bit more and fill this in, and then do the lemon. So I like to put in the main color, and while it's still wet, I put in the color next to it and blend it into it. I talked a lot about that in last week's video about how to blend student acrylics like oils, and that's one of the techniques from that video. There's a link to it in the description below. It's just a matter of building up the colors, and then it starts to take on a more realistic look. I think I'll put in some of this color of the cloth because it's not pure white, and I want to have it against the edge of the bowl. That's the thing is, I wouldn't mix this from black because it would look way too neutral. There's some color in here. I sound like a broken record, but that's the thing about mixing colors is you notice this all the time, that your mind just thinks, well, that looks like gray, or maybe it's pure white. But if you actually look at it and compare your color to it, you'll get a much more accurate color. I think I'll start putting in the lemon color. I'll start with the color on top, and then work my way down. I think what helps make it look like glass is the way this blue affects the yellow color. So the more of this I add in there, the more this should start to look like glass. So that's the bright lemon color. And what's interesting is if you look at this, would you think of that as a lemon color, or even that? That looks like more like an orange. But this is the color that it is. Over here it does get more yellowish. Now for the lighter section, I could probably add a little bit of the lemon yellow. This is the darker lemon color for the section where you're looking at it through the glass. It doesn't look right, but when you compare it, it's pretty close. I think maybe it needs to go a shade lighter, but it's not too bad. I took a break for lunch, and I put the lid on here to keep the paints wet. I also mist the top of it so there's more moisture in there, and I put a wet sponge in there. That's all to keep the humidity up so these paints don't dry out. When I use open acrylics, I don't have to put a sponge in here or anything. They stay wet for days. I have an entire video about how I set up this palette. There's a link to it in the description below. I also have another video about 6 different types of palettes for acrylic painting. I'm just working on the stripes here, which are kind of complicated. So I'm going to continue to work on that. It's going to take a while, and I have to put the shadow in underneath these lemons. So I probably won't show all of that, but this is a big part of making this look transparent, is that you can see these lemons through the glass, and the glass is altering the color. I finished these blue stripes. Now I'll focus on finishing the right side of this bowl. There's a lot of abstract shapes in here, and what helps is I already have the lemon established in the edge of this. So basically I have to draw the shapes within here with paint. There's some subtle blending effects in here. It shouldn't be too hard. I have most of these colors already mixed. It's just a matter of taking your time and filling it in. I filled in all the colors on the blue bowl. Now I'll work on the glass, but it won't make sense until I put the background in. Since this background is so dark, if I were to paint the glass first with all these dark colors, it wouldn't look right against a white background. I'll show you a little bit of what that looks like, and then I'll paint in the background. This is the background color I mixed at the beginning. I'll start with that color, and I'll modify it so that it matches. So I think that needs to go lighter. So I'll add a little bit of white to that. It looks too dark. It's not bad. Maybe a little more blue. I think that's about right. I'll just put that in there for now. This is pretty much the same color in this entire shape. I think it just gets a little bit lighter on the side. I added a touch of white so I can get this corner a little bit lighter. And I think this color is pretty much the same for this section right here. I have those colors blocked in. I think I'll just lighten it up and do these 2 sections. So maybe I'll take a little bit of this color and lighten it up. I'm always thinking about how I can use existing colors as a shortcut. Okay, I probably went too light. So I add some more of this color back in. It's not bad for that area, so maybe I'll paint that in there. I'm going to thin this out with a little bit of water so I can paint like a fine line. Twist the brush a little bit to get a point on it. And I can use it to paint this rim on the glass. It seems like this rim is pretty much the same highlight color, so I'll just put that in there real quick. So do you see how weird this looks? This looks way too dark, but I think once I put the background color, it'll look more normal. And I could brush some of this lemonade color in here. And this doesn't even look right because do you think of this as being a lemonade color? It just looks like a putty color or something. I have some of the dark areas mapped out. Now I'll just take a little bit of this lighter color and start working that in there. I filled in the basic colors for the glass of lemonade, and it still doesn't really make sense until I put the background in. That's why painting glass is tricky. You're painting the colors that are behind it, and when you put that down on a white board, it just doesn't look right. This looks really dark. Your mind thinks about that as, that looks much too dark for a transparent piece of glass. You have to think about it this way. The color of glass is the same color of whatever's behind it, and some sections will be lighter because of the reflections. I kind of like filling in the entire board before I go back into any of these areas like on the bowl or the glass. So the next part I'm going to work on will be the background. At the start of this, I mixed up these two colors. This is the lighter side of the background, which would be right here, and this is the darker side. What I'm going to do is mix up a third color that's halfway between these two. That way I can paint it down the middle here and blend it into the darker section and then blend it into the lighter section. So I'll just take a scoop of this and some of the lighter color and just mix it together. I might have to mix up more of the dark color. It doesn't look like I have that much of it. I have my darkest color that I just mixed up, somewhat of a middle color, and then the lightest section. I'll start with the dark color on the right hand side. I might have to go over this a second time just to get the colors exactly the way I want it, but for now I'll just block it in. Putting in this background color starts to complete the illusion of this glass being transparent. Now I'll take a second brush and put this medium color in there. Then I just try and soften the edge where those two meet. So I like to take a soft brush and do circular motions just to blend those two colors together, and then do straight brush strokes like that to smooth it out. And I'll do that up here. I don't think I'm going to try and get it perfect. I'm getting a lot of glare on this because it's still wet. I'm going to put a second coat on the background and smooth it out. I mixed up 4 different shades for the background color, and I'm going to use some of this slow dry medium just to make it dry slower. It says you can add up to a 1-to-1 ratio of slow dry medium to paint. I'm not going to use that much. I'll just squeeze out a little bit for each color. I'll start with the lighter color and work my way over. I did change it a bit. I think I added more yellow to it. I felt like it was a little bit too purple. Putting it on just a little bit thicker so that it dries slower. And as I work my way up, I'll start using the darker colors. I'm using this soft mop brush just to like smooth it out a little bit. Instead of trying to get the whole thing in and blending it at once, I'm just doing it in sections. As I make my way across, I'll add more of the darker colors. I'm just sort of like softening that edge. I can clean off my mop brush and just go and give it some circular blending motions, and then go back and forth. It's not too bad. I've got most of this transition done, and the rest of this is pretty much the same. It does get a little bit lighter over here, but I could just pretty much block this in. The color's a little different. I think it does have more magenta in it. Most of the painting is finished. Now it's time for the refinements. There's a lot in here that needs to be smoothed out, and there's some details missing. I need to work on this cutting board and some of this other stuff too, but it's mostly just like subtle changes. Here's the finished painting after I put in the final details. Up next, you can watch my videos about how to blend acrylics like oils. Thanks for watching.